All right, ready to explore a world where nothing is quite as it seems.
Always up for a little existential exploration. What have we got lined up for today's deep dive?
Today, we are diving into the depths of Albert Camus' The Stranger.
Ah, The Stranger, a classic. A book that never fails to spark debate and maybe even a touch of existential angst.
It's one of those books that just grabs you from the first line, Mama died today, or yesterday maybe, I don't know. Talk about an opener.
Camus certainly knew how to make an entrance, didn't he? And that single sentence, it throws us right into the heart of Meursault's world, a world where even the most fundamental emotions seem, well, a little off.
It's like he's almost indifferent to his own mother's death. Is he cold-hearted? Or just, I don't know, strangely detached from everything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Camus wants us to wrestle with it. Because Meursault, he embodies that central tension in absurdist thought. The clash between our innate desire for meaning and the universe's seeming indifference to our search.
Okay, so we've got this character who's practically allergic to deep emotion, adrift in a world that feels meaningless.
And here's the thing. It's not just that Meursault is detached. It's the way his detachment exposes the absurdity of everyone else's reaction.
Exactly, like that scene at his mother's vigil where he's more focused on the weather than on, mourning.
Yeah.
It's jarring, but it also makes you question what's considered a normal response to grief.
Right. It's like he's holding up a mirror to all those unspoken social expectations we have, especially around something as profound as death.
And the more we see those expectations through Meursault's eyes, the more absurd they start to seem.
Precisely. Camus is using Meursault, this seemingly unfeeling character, to make us feel something deeply, a kind of unsettling awareness of the absurdity of it all.
And speaking of feeling, can we talk about the sun for a minute? Camus doesn't just use it as a backdrop in The Stranger, it's practically a character itself.
Oh, absolutely. That Algerian sun, it's relentless, oppressive almost. It beats down on Meursault and everyone around him, this constant presence.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on one hand, the sun is this life-giving force, but on the other hand, it's also kind of suffocating.
Exactly. And that duality plays right into Camus's whole exploration of absurdity, because the sun, it doesn't care about human suffering, about justice, about any of the things we usually associate with meaning in life. It just, exists.
It's indifferent, just like the universe itself. And that indifference, it seems to weigh on Meursault, especially in that crucial scene on the beach.
The scene with the Arab? Oh, that scene is pivotal. Talk about a pressure cooker of tension. The heat, the light, it all seems to build up to that moment of violence.
Yeah, it's like the sun itself is pushing Meursault toward that act.
Do you think the murder was premeditated or, I don't know, more like a spontaneous reaction to the overwhelming physical environment?
That's the question that has haunted readers for decades. And, I don't think Camus wants to give us a straight answer. Because the point isn't really about why Meursault pulls the trigger. It's about what happens afterward. The trial, that's where things get really interesting.
Because suddenly, that same detachment that made Meursault such an enigma, it becomes his biggest liability. Exactly. He's on trial for murder, yes, but he's also on trial for his lack of outward grief, his inability to play the part of the grieving son. It's like society needs him to perform a certain kind of remorse, a certain kind of humanity, in order to, well, make sense of his action.
It's like they're more offended by his honesty, his refusal to fake emotions he doesn't feel, than they are by the crime itself.
And isn't that something we see all the time, even in our own lives? The pressure to conform to these unspoken expectations of how we're supposed to act, especially in the face of tragedy.
Absolutely. It's like we all have these scripts we're supposed to follow, and if we deviate from them, well, people don't know what to do with us.
And that's what makes Meursault such a powerful literary figure. He refuses to play the game. He exposes the absurdity of it all just by being himself.
And it's that refusal to play the game that really gets under everyone's skin during the trial.
Oh, absolutely. It's one thing to commit a crime, but to not show the proper remorse, that's unforgivable in the eyes of society.
Exactly. Meursault, he's like a walking, talking challenge to their sense of order and decency. And the more they try to make sense of him, to fit him into their neat little boxes of guilt and innocence, the more obvious it becomes that their boxes are, well, kind of absurd.
Right. It's like they need him to confess, to express remorse, not just for his own sake, but for theirs. It's as if his honesty, his refusal to play the part of the grieving son, somehow threatens the very foundations of their world.
It's interesting, though, because even though Meursault is the one on trial, it's almost like Camus is using him to put society itself on trial.
Oh, 100%. And that's where the novel goes beyond a simple courtroom drama and becomes something much more profound. It's about the human condition, about our need for meaning and purpose in a world that often seems devoid of both.
And then there's Salamano and his dog. Talk about a subplot that packs an emotional punch.
Oh, gosh, yes. You know, Salamano, he's this grumpy old man who everyone seems to dislike. He mistreats his dog, yet he's heartbroken when it dies.
But it's Meursault who seems to understand Salamano's grief more than anyone. He might not express it outwardly, but he sees the raw, primal connection between them. It's like he recognizes the absurdity of judging someone for how they grieve, even if they've mistreated the one they lost.
Exactly. It's like Camus is saying that genuine emotion, real connection, it can exist even in the most unexpected places. And that sometimes the people who seem the most detached are the ones who see us most clearly.
It's in those final moments in prison, though, that Meursault finally seems to find some measure of peace, wouldn't you say?
I think so. Remember that passage where he talks about finding meaning in the simplest things? The way the light falls on a wall, the sound of a bird singing. It's like he's finally free from all the noise and expectations of the outside world, and he's able to connect with something deeper, something true.
And that final outburst against the chaplain, rejecting the promise of an afterlife, it's like he's choosing to embrace the present moment, the absurdity of it all, rather than cling to comforting illusions.
It's a powerful moment of defiance. He's essentially saying, this life, this moment is all we have, and I'm going to face it on my own terms.
So after this deep dive into the stranger, into absurdity and alienation, what do we take away from it all? What's the message, if there is one?
I think the message, if we can even call it that, is that there are no easy answers. Life is messy, it's confusing, and it often feels meaningless. But within that absurdity, there's also a strange kind of beauty. A freedom to create our own meaning, to define our own values, and to live authentically, even if it means going against the grain.
And maybe, just maybe, by embracing the absurdity, by accepting that the universe doesn't owe us any answers, we can find a different kind of peace. A quiet kind of joy in the everyday moments, like the warmth of the sun on our skin or the sound of laughter in the distance.
Exactly. It's about finding those flickers of light in the darkness, those moments of genuine connection that make life worth living, even when it feels absurd.
Well, there you have it. The Stranger by Albert Camus. A novel that continues to provoke, to challenge, and to remind us that sometimes the most meaningful answers are the ones we find within ourselves.
Absolutely. And as Camus himself once wrote, in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. So, as you go about your day, remember that even in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there's always the potential for warmth, for growth, for an invincible summer within each of us.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the heart of existentialism. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking out those moments of absurd beauty in your own life.